We're talking with Sheryl Worsley. She's the Vice President of Podcasting for Bonneville, and she oversees directly the KSL podcasts in Salt Lake City. And Sheryl, where are the other markets these days for Bonneville? It is for those who don't know, a well-established, as in over 100 years, broadcasting company that is very widely respected. Where are you guys
100 years
at now?
this year, actually. Yeah. So we've got the Salt Lake City market. We have stations in Phoenix, in Denver, in Seattle, Sacramento, and the San Jose, the Bay Area.
So I have long admired and encouraged, when I could, Bonneville for getting into the podcast space as aggressively as you have. And they made a very wise decision when they moved you. Not that you needed to be moved. You were doing just fine as news director for KSL Radio in Salt Lake City, but to this podcasting position. And they've since added some VP stripes, and you've done a wonderful job.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And recently, also, I see you have some podcasting related responsibilities at the Radio and Television News Directors Association.
Yeah, it's RTDNA, so it's Radio, Television, Digital News. So we have rebranded to acknowledge the journalists working in the digital space. So that's been a more recent development. But
cool.
Yeah, so working with journalists all over the country in not only broadcast but digital and podcast spaces as well. So it's an exciting time. They just elected me chair-elect. And it's a 3-year gig. So I'm about to find out what busy looks like.
Yeah, as if you didn't know already.
Right?
Well, I remember, Sheryl, not that long ago, after you had great success with the #1 podcast, Cold, and you've since followed up with season 2, and season 3 is coming. Being at a pitch meeting with you in Los Angeles, when the remark was made by one of the wonderful people that we were calling upon, and I do mean that, let's see if lightning can strike twice. As in, maybe it couldn't, because here's this fledgling podcast network based out of a broadcast facility in Salt Lake City. There aren't a lot of those that are doing anything around the country. I hate to say it. That launched its own podcast, went to #1. It got picked up for wider distribution after it went #1. Could you lightning strike twice? It has. Congratulations.
Thank you.
You've been #1 for over a week as of this recording on the letter. Fantastic.
So very exciting. We were ranked in the first few days. So that was exciting, but hit #1 on day 5 and then maintained that for more than a week. So it's been fantastic for us to do that and prove that it's not just the Cold franchise that can do that we can as a smaller podcast shop do this on repeat. So it's a great vote of confidence in the KSL podcast team, and we're thrilled to do that with our partner this time around, which is Lemonada.
What kind of stories do you look for when you are choosing the next one to assign staff and create another great franchise like Cold or The Letter?
Great. No, that's a great question. Looking for stories that are interesting, that help people connect with other humans, that people can relate to. And when we're talking about true crime, we're actually looking for things that are different from what is traditionally happening in the true crime space. It's very important to us that we are not sensationalistic or telling someone's tragedy just to relive their tragedy. What we're looking for is a purpose behind telling that story. So, for example, first season of Cold, it was the Susan Powell case file. So we were looking at what was happening to Susan, and one of the emergent themes that we noticed was that Susan was not physically abused, but there were a lot of red flag warnings about non-physical domestic abuse happening to her. She was isolated. She was being financially controlled. she was being emotionally battered.
Mm-hmm.
And there were things that repeated in her life that were warning flags for domestic abuse. And as we know, tragically, what happened to her is her life ended. She disappeared. Nobody's found her body. But so the theme, that emerging theme, felt like something that we could wrap our arms around in warning people at the end of episodes. Look, if you need domestic abuse resources, call that hotline.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are seeing these red flags in your life or in the life of a loved one, then please reach out for help.
Yeah, don't ignore it.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and in the case of the letter, it's a different story entirely. It is also a true crime,
Mm-hmm.
but it is unlike any story that you're going to find in the true crime category, because yes, there's a crime that happens, but that is only the beginning of the story. The story really is about redemption, forgiveness, and the different pathways through grief. It's a beautiful story.
Beautiful story.
So it's going to be different from what you're going to see in true crime. But anything that we do, we try to do with purpose. What are some themes that can be pulled out, and how can that better us instead of just a retell? I
think we use words like interesting and compelling so often to describe what we're looking for, and that's all well and good. But those are adjectives for the stories. What you have really focused on, I think, is the emotions, the reactions to the stories.
Yeah, it's the connection. It's all
the connection in both of those cases. Human
connection. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in the cases where there are crime victims, we want to make sure we're honoring the victim and trying a victim-centered approach versus, crime, murder. We want to make sure, to the degree that it's possible, that the voices of the vanished is what Dave Cawley, how he would put that, are heard and are not lost.
Dave Cawley, afternoon drive news reporter anchor on KSL Radio. When he began this whole podcasting journey, he took an interest in the Susan Powell case. And that's where this came from, right? The podcast for Cold, and eventually, in many ways, got Bonneville encouraged to invest more in podcasting, having seen that success both commercially, but also knowing Bonneville emotionally and in a way of as a means of serving communities.
Yeah. No. So you're right. But Dave worked in our newsroom. I was news director at the time. He was not only a reporter and an anchor of newscasts, but also the producer of our afternoon drive. So big responsibility for Dave. And you're right. Got the case file for the Susan Powell case and started to notice things in the case file that pointed toward things like audio journals that Josh Powell kept. And so we knew that we needed to file open records requests for those and get those. But it started to frustrate Dave because you cannot tell a satisfying story to a reporter in a minute and a half. And that's about the time, the longest reports that we had on the radio in the format were a minute 30. Yeah. And you can't tell an entire story in a minute 30. Yeah. And we had both been looking at different places. Serial had been going on. I had attended a conference where, I noticed the Cincinnati Enquirer had done something called The Accused. It was a one case story arc. And those are print reporters. Mm-hmm. I ought to be able to figure this out. We're audio people.
Yeah.
So Dave and I both came to the conclusion that in order to tell this story in a full way, in a satisfying way, and in the best way, it's a podcast. So it was convince our management that that's what needed to happen. And we successfully did that. To Bonneville's credit, upper management caught that vision and said, hey, there's something here. and we're going to put Dave on this full time. And eventually, the entirety of my time was focused on podcasting as well. So, yeah, Dave, that case started it all for us. We were doing onesie, twosie interview style podcasts here and there. We had done a little bit of experimentation. Anchor had written an audiobook. So we had done a book, and which she then read as an audiobook. So we did that and a few little things. But this was our biggest resource commitment, and frankly, our biggest payoff after it launched.
Right. So I'm assuming that Dave Cawley no longer is the afternoon drive reporter on KSL News Radio.
Yeah, no, that changed after that conversation with upper management, and he was made a full-time podcast producer.
So what kind of staffing do you have now? Not to get nosy, but the resources have continued to flow as you have earned them.
Yes. We're still what I would consider a small team, but with the success of Cold, we were able to hire, 4 more producers. Mm-hmm. And the letter team was hired off of Cold's success. So the 2 people working on the letter, Amy Donaldson and Andrea Smarden, are the primary people working on the letter. We do have some support staff, and we do put it through editorial group listens, and we do. But primary on that are Amy and Andrea, hired off of the success of the letter. And I have 2 more producers in the mix now because of what Cold yielded.
So where do you find that staff? Where do you find people that can tell those great stories through podcasting?
Good question.
Yeah. Or do they find you now?
A little bit of both. I have people who know what we do and are happy with what we do, refer their friends to me, and so that's helpful. But you have some amazing audio work being done in public radio. So I will find someone in public radio on occasion and look for that. But frankly, other podcast production companies is where you find some amazing talent and people in this space. So you look for people who are doing this type of work. And hire them.
You and I are both primarily, proudly, content people. But I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about the monetization side of podcasting, because I'm sure you are asked these things and you have many observations. Why do you think it's difficult? You are embedded there. You're in the building there as we speak with some traditional media, radio and TV. There's also co-owned print a few blocks away. Why is it sometimes difficult for salespeople of traditional media to sell podcast ads? What do you think?
Well, I think it's because of the focus. They are focused on selling the traditional media, and that takes all of their focus. So that's not a knock on them. That is their primary role. And until someone tells them otherwise, then that's what they're going to focus on. Right. And it's a tough job right now, selling traditional media and print media. Mm-hmm. Even digital media can be a dogfight, right? So sure. There's no fault that I've given to, I'm not faulting anyone who is in that space and selling in that space. Right. So until it's made a priority, like, hey, you need to figure out and sell podcast ads, then it won't be a priority to them. And it's a tough hole right now just selling the traditional media. So there's that. On top of that, there's learning curve with podcasts, right? So you may or may not know how to sell a podcast. If you're not listening to podcasts and you don't get it, it would be difficult to sell that product. So if a salesperson has been tasked with selling podcasts, they need to be familiar with what podcasts are and kind of the difference between what is happening on a traditional broadcast radio station or TV station and how it's different from podcasting. Because while, for example, radio and podcasting can both be very conversational and should be if you're doing radio right, and podcasting very much the same, but it's also different in that it is not a quick thing. It is much more in depth. It is your opportunity to go places that you can't necessarily go on the radio because of format, because of time restrictions. And it's important that you understand the differences so that you get how to sell it. Because if you can tell a client that, look, not only is this podcast more niche than you're going to get on the radio station, so we're talking to your people,
Right.
They can go in depth in a way that the radio station can't. And so it is your super client. It is your super customers here, because these are already your people because of, topic matches the client, right?
Right.
So it's important to know the differences as well as the similarities so that you can effectively sell that.
And the passion, definitely. We find this, that the number one determinant, and it's not surprising, of whether a decision maker decides to advertise in podcasting or create a podcast for a brand is their own personal passion for podcasts. To ask an entire sales department, podcasting is not ubiquitous yet. It is not something that everybody loves with the same level of passion. And those that do care a lot about it and spend a lot of their own commuting time and workout time or whatever listening to podcasts probably are not only the buyers of podcast advertising, but the sellers.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned passion. The listeners of a podcast who are devoted to that podcast are much more likely to buy from a client that their podcast host mentioned, as you
True.
very well know, Dave.
Yeah.
The passion index is really high on follow through to listeners of their favorite podcast.
It's true, and the data proves it for sure. So, as you know, our company, Sound That Brand, specializes a lot in branded content. And the principles that we were just talking about, the concepts of that integration of content and the targeting the content and marrying that target to advertisers and so forth, those concepts are even more emphasized when the entire podcast is sponsored by a titled sponsor and is considered part of the branded podcast category. Any advice for brands that might be considering branded podcasts or other people in the podcast space? What have you seen in that area about that passion that we were just talking about?
Yeah. Well, the story and the content need to come first in those branded podcasts, because what you can sometimes find is a client will want to put, oh, let's have you interview our CEO and it will be amazing. And I'm here to tell you, it won't be amazing. It will feel like an ad to the listener.
Yeah.
So you have to come up with an idea that is adjacent to your client. Like if you, for example, Boeing did something about, hobby flyers or hobby pilots or something that would make sense to a passion connected to it, whatever it is your client does, right? Your company does.
Yeah.
You need
values.
Yeah, you need something that is real content to people. For example, if you have say you're doing an outdoor recreation show, and a lot of it is hiking and trail running, and the people who do that and are kind of amazing because they do 100-mile runs through the mountains or the desert. So these are really dedicated people. You might find a running company who wants to do a branded podcast, but the content needs to be those stories
Right.
on the endurance runs, the mental strength that you need in order to do that, and why these athletes got into it. So that's amazing content, and it happens to be sponsored by this shoe company or whatever.
Right. Right. Because they know it's speaking to their people, but it isn't a commercial.
Right. So the content needs to be authentic and valuable to an audience, and not feel like it's a commercial.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's not an easy putt. It really isn't. It is, I think especially, and there have been some local media attempts at branded as well. And that's where it's especially tough to come up with those content ideas and have the client understand, have that objectivity to understand when it's beginning to sound like a commercial.
So I would suggest you have content people on the team that is brainstorming, not just the marketing team, but invite some content first types to those brainstorming meetings, so you can come up with something that feels like content, but also hits where the marketing team needs it to hit, but it needs to be really, really content first and adjacent to your product, and you're getting the credit for it, right? Because your company is sponsoring this great content. And the people that are listening are likely going to be supporters, because if they love the content and the host, they're going to want to support that host.
Right.
And it's a beautiful thing when that can work.
The Radio Advertising Bureau has recently announced that they are commissioning a study about how local markets, local broadcasters can get into podcasting as a revenue source. To date, there are some companies like Bonneville and some of the giant radio companies that have created podcast divisions. In most cases, those sit off to the side. Yours is more integrated, but they sit off to the side, and they are a new digital project that, other than cross promotion, doesn't have a whole lot to do with the broadcast side of those companies, nor the local markets. Do you foresee a day when there will be more operations, perhaps similar to yours, that are locally based in the markets? You work with other Bonneville markets too, but it's all mostly local type projects that can grow and become national, as you have proven. Do you see more of that happening in radio?
More local type podcasts? Yeah, absolutely. Because you can super serve your local audience. You've got to be smart about it, right? So you've got to find ways to do content that is different from what you're doing on air and of value. But if you're attracting audience, what we've got to stop doing is worrying about eroding audience from a radio station because people are now listening to us on a podcast. Right. I would submit to you, if the people are listening on a podcast, they're probably not listening to you on the radio. So what we need to do is look at that as it is a net gain, not a net loss, as far as audience is concerned. But there are plenty of things that you can do that are not terribly time intensive, that add to what you're doing on air, and you can tease back and forth. If you're doing a sports show, you can tease something that you did in the podcast space. You've gone a little bit farther. You've talked to a different guest here on the podcast. And if you want to check it out, go to the podcast. And then on the podcast, you can tease what you're doing tomorrow on the radio. So there are some things that you can do to leverage audiences back and forth. From a content end of things, though, I think a strategy should and could be, why not produce something that's going to exceed what you've got in your local market? Why not find something that's going to attract audiences potentially outside of the current local revenue pie where you're getting dollars? Why not?
Why not?
Because if you can do it well and you can make it apply to an audience outside of your market, that means those revenue dollars can be yours.
That's right. It gets you outside as a broadcaster. It gets you outside of the limitations of your signals.
Yep.
It's you go everywhere. People have listened to your podcast, millions of people around the nation, around the world. Yeah. And that advertising, now you have the opportunity to sell advertising to those people as well. What percentage just of local listeners, what percentage of your local listeners to, let's say, The Letter have probably listened to KSL radio? You have any idea about what the overlap might be?
Now, that's an excellent question. I don't know that I have the number on that. I know that there is a certain percentage of podcast listeners who do not listen to the radio, and that's not a KSL specific number.
Sure.
I'm trying to pull up the actual percentage, but I believe it's like a 20% overlap, that 80% of podcast listeners don't listen to traditional radio.
So this is
wrong on that. So you're going to have to check me.
We'll check
That is the stat that comes to my brain. Again, not KSL specific, but it is your audience is not being eroded because people are listening to podcasts. Those people have already left.
NPR, like you, a pioneer in the field of broadcasting, making the transition to podcasting, I'm sure had to convince those local affiliates that they were not cannibalizing that local audience, certainly to the degree that the local stations might have been worried. The average listener to NPR, I know, is older on the radio. It's a different audience than it is on podcasting. It's a very different audience.
Yeah, same is true for commercial radio. You're going to get an older audience listening, and the demographic skews younger on podcasting. So it's your product. So if you're putting out a podcast that's either the same or different from what you do on the radio, it's your product, and they have exposure to your station's brand. Mm-hmm. So we've got to get over ourselves and recognize that they're still loyal to me in some way. Right. And we've got to stop telling people, you need to make an appointment and make sure you're here at this time to get what I've prepared for you. So that is not the way people live.
The KSL ecosystem now gets to grow beyond those who listen to radio. Or look at a local website for that matter, or any of the other platforms that you're on. Each additional platform, including podcasting, takes that KSL brand and KSL as a service to the community far wider. Yep. Something I saw today that was interesting, Burrell and Associates, they do surveys of local media, advertisers, that sort of thing. They came out with some information about advertisers who advertise in newspapers, local advertisers. And they found that these advertisers felt strongly that local newspapers were important to their community. And they also felt a little more strongly than advertisers in other local media that by supporting the newspaper, they were seeming to be and truly being supportive of their community, so that their customers would see that they are supportive, responsible, active members of the community. And I wonder if there might be a similar opportunity for local advertisers on local podcasts that do have a local content emphasis. And I recall my own early days in small town radio when we had one signal all the time, of course, no websites. And we would do things like local high school sports, community Christmas concerts or whatever, and put these things on the radio with local sponsors, not because they drew a lot of listeners, but because someone would advertise on those to support the community and to show the parents of those kids that were in those musicals or that were playing on that basketball court that these advertisers support your team, support your community.
Yeah.
And now with podcasts, we have the opportunity again as broadcasters, I'll put myself back in the broadcasting role, to do that without interrupting that one signal that is so important for ratings purposes.
Right. Yeah.
And offer those local community services.
Yeah, you've got another whole nother revenue stream if you're willing to utilize it. Right. Now, it does take time and resources to put together a podcast, a hyper-local podcast. So don't get me wrong. I recognize that this is not something that you can just snap your fingers and have done. People have to curate the content and do the content. Mm-hmm. But you can hyper-serve a hyper-local community and maintain what you're doing on your radio station or mm-hmm. TV station. So that revenue doesn't erode. And you could potentially pick up new revenue. And, maybe they are smaller clients, but you could get them in the door and get them rolling on something that doesn't have to take a ton of time. It could be, a 20-minute podcast once a week, or it could be, 5 minutes Monday through Friday. It does not need to be a 60-minute pre-produced narrative in order to get you there.
How many hours go into each minute of Cold or the Letter?
That would be very difficult to calculate, but I can tell you that it's more than a year for every season that we've done. First season was a little bit more than that because Dave was working that before we actually made him full-time. So you're talking 12 plus months, year and a half on season 2, and it will be just over a year on season 3 of full-time work and more than one person.
Right.
So season 3, we will have 3 people, Dave included, working.
So quite an investment, and it could be that some of the hyper-local, as you call them, podcasts that a broadcaster might do are so narrowly targeted that it's okay that you might just turn the microphones on and 30 minutes later turn them off because you put out an interesting discussion, spontaneous as it might be, about some local issue or some local event you can support, what have you. But to really make the kind of investment that Bonneville has made in these podcasts that are so fascinating and so compelling and elicit such emotion and passion from its listeners that they go national and worldwide, as you have, that's a big investment. That's a big investment.
The last of your question cut off, but yeah, it's no small investment. It is a high investment. It is a risk, right?
Yeah.
You don't know that the next thing you do is going to pay off, but it won't if you don't try it.
Yes.
Well,
and that's
try it.
Full circle back to the beginning of our conversation. You've just put your finger on why I so admire Bonneville for its support of you and of podcasting, of making you VP of podcasting for the whole company, and what you can do with other markets as well as Salt Lake City now, that they're willing to take that risk. Mm-hmm. Too often in broadcasting, for various reasons, there is not that ability or willingness, one or the other or both, to take risk on content. And it can certainly pay off.
Yeah, well, high risk can become high reward, but it won't be if you are too chicken to try. So yes. I'm actually very, very honored and pleased with Bonneville for taking the risk on the content and letting us prove that it's not a risk, right? We can do this.
Right.
It takes time and effort and resources, but the rewards are there if you'll do it.
Sheryl Worsley, thank you so much for your time.
You bet. Thanks, Dave.